Hey guys, welcome back. If this is the first time visiting me, then welcome. This is just kind of a quick spin off for my earlier tutorial where I do pretty much a complete song deconstruction for Benny Blanco's East Side. I'll post a link on the description. Check it out if you're into that kind of thing. But I thought I'll focus a little bit on the kind of sound design element and specifically on reverse engineering the kick, bass drum. I kind of just pointed it out briefly in that tutorial video, which is pretty long, but I'm actually pretty happy with the kick I got. I thought it sounds pretty damn close to the kick they have, and regardless, I think it's just a nice kick that you can all use. I actually post a link to that as well. You guys can just grab it off of my SoundCloud, and then I also wanted to just show you kind of how I went about creating it, and really, I think this is kind of a good template for how you can go and create your own kicks. I think you'll find that 99% of the time, a kick is built in this way. So obviously nowadays, with sites like Splice and just sample packs being all over the place, it's easy to just try and kind of find a good kick right off the shelf. But sometimes you do need to customize or tweak kicks for your track. Make sure they're in tune with your track. In some genres, that's more important than others. And in those cases, it's good to know how to go about it, what goes into making a kick. So I'm not going to play the original track. I will post a link to that as well. You can check it out. And again, just check out my original tutorial to kind of listen to the original, and where I also kind of do a quick A-B. But let me just play you the kick real quick for a few bars. That's kind of the basic loop that track really has. Let me make sure that all the frequencies are in and we're not doing anything weird. All right, great. So cool. Let me just kind of show you what I did here. I'm using Ableton. Obviously, you can do this in any DAW. You can do it in Logic. You can do it in whatever. So what I did, I set up a drum rack. You can do it differently too. You can have it set up so that there's a single cell which would trigger all three samples. I personally like doing it this way when I'm actually doing the sound design, and then later I will just print it. I would export or render it into like a WAV file, and then I have a single sample that now I can use, as one cell. But when I'm actually creating the sound, I like splitting up the layers so I have easy access to them. I basically have three layers, and I think you'll find that this is kind of true for most of the kicks you end up building. You have your bottom kind of subby layer. You have your kind of mid-rangey, more punchy kind of sound. This is often, well, what you'd relate to if you think about an acoustic drum. It's kind of the beater, a little upper, and then you got your kind of click, top hit. I think I might have gotten those two up flipped, by the way. This is my hat and this is my kind of mid-rangey, but I'll play it for you in a sec. So anyway, let's start with the kick, with the sub. I'm using Kick 2. This is just an awesome synthesizer to create your own kicks from scratch. I had the original version. It was, I think, like Nicky Romero kick, something like that, and now they just released it as Kick 2. Awesome plugin. I mean, you can really just shape the wave, shape the amplitude envelope, add 3 layers of clicks, add compression, distortion. This is a great plug. If we listen just to this kick solo, it sounds something like this. So right off the bat, you can tell it's actually not that subby. Part of the reason is that I cut the length pretty short. It's at about 110 milliseconds. Controlling the length or decay or sustain of your kicks and percussive element in general makes a huge difference. Whatever it is you're doing, whatever track you're making, think about the envelope of your percussive elements. Sometimes if it's a pretty sparse arrangement, you want just a huge kick with a huge sub, you can make it long. And obviously 808s are kind of the extreme example of that, where you have just this long ringing tail. In a lot of other genres, especially more up-tempo beats, or where you have a more busy arrangement, maybe something else is occupying that sub territory, you actually want your percussive elements to be more on the punchy, transient side. And in those cases, you very well might want to consider keeping them short. So that's what I did in this case. Moving on to kind of the more mid-rangey sample, I found some nice sample that kind of has more of that acoustic kick, mid-range tone. It sounds something like this. Sounds a little, has a little bit of a room kind of ring to it, like it was recorded, obviously more like a live kick in a room. So it gives it a little extra flavor. Then finally I have this kind of little hi-hat that I put on top. Sound like this. One thing to note, and this is again a tip you can use in your stuff, I transpose the hi-hat, so there's no rules here really. You just kind of go with what sounds good to you. In this case, it just sounded a little better to me when it was transposed one semitone up. Another thing you can do, which I didn't really get into in this case because the sample was already pretty good, but you can adjust, as I just mentioned, the envelope of the sound. If you're using a Ableton sampler, you have controls over that right here. If you go to controls, you got to make sure you're using this classic mode, I guess, otherwise you won't see it. But once you do, well, I guess you can always see it here. Honestly, the transpose is what really only shows up here. And also filtered it, so you have a very easy way of filtering out sounds in Ableton. If you're using sampler, this is just a nice way that you don't need to set up a whole new filter. So I'm just kind of filtering it out a little bit. Without it, it's a little too harsh. If I remove it, it sounds like if I edit. So I didn't honestly feel like I needed that high frequency content in this case, so I filtered it out. And again, all together, it sounds something like this. One thing I'll mention, and I go over this at length in the tutorial, I'm using this kind of cool trick that I noticed it's pretty common in the tropical house genre and really elsewhere. I think if you listen to Drake's album Scorpion, fucking massive hit, then the first track has just an awesome kick, and I think they use that trick there too, where there is this kind of slight delay or offset between the click layer or kind of these top layers of the kick and the bottom, and it just gives it this really nice presence. And I don't know how to call it really, but basically what I ended up doing is just kind of doing it manually. So I literally have those top two layers offset kind of from the main kick, so they just come a little before and they just give it that cool sound. That's just another trick you can use. So if you're learning sounds other than shaping the envelope, shaping the frequency content with filtering, you can also play around with, how you're offsetting things. And obviously, a lot of people in EDM would do that with claps. So one of the biggest things people used to do and still do is take, if you have a clap sample, you offset it a little bit so it'll come a little bit before the beat or sometimes after if you want more of a lazy, kind of laid back feel. Same is true here, only it's done much more, much more, I would say, kind of maybe, 2, 3, 4, 5 milliseconds at most. I think this is very, very subtle. So that's another device you can use. Then moving on, let's talk a little bit about shaping up the whole kick as a whole. So you have your samples, you did some envelope shaping, you did some frequency carving, you maybe used some offset. Now you kind of want to take the whole thing and just kind of glue it together and just give it that final nice kind of tone. Typically what you do here involves some form of EQ, compression, and then adding some kind of saturation or drive. It's pretty much what I do. If you look at what I got here, I got an equalizer. I'm using Fab Filter, which is great. I actually went pretty nuts with this. But honestly, I was just going by listening and comparing it to the kick. I was, again, kind of reverse engineering, which is the one from that East Side track. And this is what I ended up with. So another nice tip for you here is there's really no rules. I mean, people tell you should be very gentle with EQ and, try and use cuts more than boosts. That's all fine when you're actually mixing. When you're doing sound design, don't worry about it too much. And in fact, even when mixing, I'd say at the end of the day, really the only rule is if it sounds good, it is good. Just make sure you're referencing on a couple of different systems, right? So might sound good in your room, but if your room's not treated or your speakers aren't the best in the world, you'll take it to your car or listen on your iPhone earbuds. It's going to sound like crap. You don't want that. So make sure you are referencing on different monitors. But having said that, if it sounds good to you, just follow your instinct. That's always what works for me. Following on that, I've been using Ableton 10's drum bus a lot. I like it. I find that using it on an actual drum bus, sometimes it can make it a little too crisp, too bright. So you got to be careful. You can use their dry wet to mix it in, but it's actually also pretty good for sound design. So if you just want to put it on something like this where you're learning a bunch of stuff together and then you want to use its compressor and its drive and clipping and crunch and damp, you can do a lot with this guy, right? So it's actually a big part of the sound. If I play it with and without, it's kind of a big difference, right? And it's just this one device. Following it, I'm doing a little more saturation with this guy. One thing, another cool trick you can take from this, I'm using this bass control, which basically lets you control how much the low frequencies are affected by the saturation. I only recently became aware of this control. It's pretty awesome, and honestly, Live's Saturator is just an awesome saturation plugin. Don't overlook it. Don't think you have to go to the FabFilter Saturn or Soundtoys Decapitator. Great plugins. You don't have to kind of go by default to them. You got this stuff right out of the box with Ableton, and I'm sure Logic and other DAWs have similar stuff. And then finally, after I did all this processing, it sounded pretty good, but it wasn't as punchy. It sounded a little long. So let me play it for you without this final plugin, which is this Transient Designer. So I'm turning it off. It's got this really long, kind of nasty tail. This is probably that room tone I mentioned from that mid layer that got squashed by the compressor. So now it's kind of sucking up all that room ambience and making it part of the sound. I didn't really need that, so I just put a Transient Designer at the end of the chain pretty much and just moved down the sustain by a lot, and this is how it sounds like. A lot tighter, obviously, and I follow all of that with the limiter. It turns out you can kind of limit the crap out of some stuff. I find that subs and kicks, you can get away with a fair amount of limiting. In this case, it's about 6 decibels, I think, 6 dB of limiting happening. It sounds pretty good to me if I take it out. And then with, you get a little extra tail, still controlled by the Transient Designer, but you can kind of hear it, and this kind of makes it a little more aggressive in your face. So I like it, but obviously you can season to taste. So that's it pretty much. I'm going to share that sample that I got out of it. Hopefully you like it, find it useful, and then even if you don't, I hope you take something out of this tutorial. And just as a quick recap, you can layer your sounds with kicks. It'll often be a sub layer, kind of this mid-range layer, and then maybe some click that's more high frequency, typically some kind of short hat. You can use some offset to create interesting effects. That's what I do here. So you can put the samples at slightly different times, maybe spread them apart by a few milliseconds to give it that interesting presence, interesting tone. You can use frequency carving, as we mentioned. You can shape the envelopes of the sounds. Use EQ to take in and out stuff you need or you don't need. This is really about your ear at the end of the day, what you're trying to go for, but definitely EQ can go a long way. Use saturation and compression and all of it. Again, trust your ear, but don't be afraid to experiment. I mean, as you can tell, some of these settings are just weird looking. You wouldn't think they'd sound good, but at the end of the day, every sample is different. Every situation is different. So if it sounds good to you, it is good. Transient Designer, if you weren't using this up till now, then this is definitely a good part of your toolkit if you're doing a lot of sound design or trying to mix percussive elements. I'm using the SPL one, which is awesome. There's a few other ones. I think Waves had one. I don't know that Ableton has one out of the box. They might in one of their Max for Live tool sets. I think Machine has one, but in any case, just Google Transient Designer, and I'm sure you'll find one that works for whatever it is you're using. Um, that's it, guys. Hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want more of this stuff or any other kind of stuff, I'm really interested in hearing what you guys are interested in. Peace out.